Hi guys, so the podcast you're about to listen to is all about definitions and the language we use around this behaviour that this podcast series is all about, Capa, or otherwise known as child to parent abuse, child and adolescent to parent violence and aggression, or violence and abuse. There's loads of different terms to describe basically the same types of behaviour. And that's kind of what this podcast is all about, having a little look at the language around it and diving into why it matters, what kind of language we use. We talk about the term abuse itself, whether we think that's helpful or not so helpful. We talk about the importance of all using the same kind of language as professionals and as parents, everyone being on the same page. So we all understand what everyone's talking about and we know how to respond. We spoke about loads of things, basically. And as with all of these conversations, they are conversations, so we cover a lot of ground. We go off on some tangents, but hopefully it's interesting. So this was actually the first one we recorded, and as with the last one, we didn't have a decent mic for Helen yet. I think this one sounds a little bit better. We were experimenting. We were kind of seeing if we could get away with being cheap and not buying another mic. But yeah, this one sounds a little bit better than the last one. But I think after doing these couple of experiments, we're like, nah, we need a mic for Helen. But hopefully you can bear with us because there's some really, really interesting stuff still. So anyway, I hope you enjoy it. Hello and welcome to the Capa podcast. My name is Matt. I'm the senior practitioner with Capa First Response. I'm joined also by Jane Griffiths, the CEO and founder of Capa First Response, and Helen Bonnick, the author, expert in the field of, Capa. So I guess a good starting place is Capa, spelt. Well, this is a really important part. How is it spelt? Child and adolescent to parent aggression and violence, CAPVA, or violence and aggression even, CAPVA, Capa, CAPA, CPA, child to parent abuse. What's our preferred term? What do you guys think? I mean, how do you refer to what we're actually talking about?
When I started in 2010, working specifically in this area, which was 12 years ago, is that? Something like that. It was very much termed a child using abusive behaviour and violent behaviour towards a parent.
Yeah.
So it felt very set that that's what we were talking about. And I remember having a conversation actually with Helen not that long ago, Helen. We were talking about so much has changed in 10 years. And we're having these conversations here and now in 2023, but no doubt so much will change in the next 10 years. So right here, right now, for me, Capa stands for child to parent aggression and or harmful behaviour, because I think that for me helps families understand what this behaviour is and doesn't, create a barrier which sometimes abuse and what abuse means to people and how it can get caught up in the domestic abuse field, which I know is what we're all going to talk about today. Yeah. But just setting my stall out a little bit that it can cause real barriers for families.
Yeah, and it's so important, isn't it? The language that you use, that straight away the what it puts you in mind of and how you're going to view the issue. Straight away you bring in the word abuse, and there's a way of looking at it. How about you, Helen?
It's a fascinating issue and a question, and there's part of me that thinks we're never going to properly answer this because as soon as we do, the language will have changed again and we'll be using something else. And if I explain what I'm thinking, when I first started looking at the issue at the beginning of 2004, 2005, the term that lots of people were using then was parent abuse.
Yeah.
But there was other terminology. They would talk about battered parents. We'd talk about the tyrannical child, challenging behaviour. But when I started using the term parent abuse, I was finding that people were misunderstanding what I meant, that they were because it was and still is such a difficult concept. The assumption was that you were talking about parents abusing children.
Yeah.
And not the other way around. So for me, that's the first lesson, that we have to use language which is very clear in what we're saying and is unambiguous. And so it's understood straight away what we're talking about. And so after that, I went on to talking about child to parent violence and abuse. And that, for me, at that time, made very clear that the parties involved, if you like, the child, and it was the direction of it towards the parent.
Yeah.
And then there was at that time a long discussion even then about, is it violence, is it abuse? Mm-hmm. All abuse is violent, all violence is abuse. That kind of discussion. And people were saying, well, just put both in. But even then, people weren't liking that. And there was a long discussion going on, particularly within the adoption community, about they felt very uncomfortable about using that terminology because the children they were working with were coming from such a place of trauma that they didn't. They felt that violence and abuse implied a great deal of intent and didn't recognise the trauma. So they started to develop different terminology. And then we started to come to a situation where people were saying, well, maybe there's two groups of children and one is using intent and one isn't. And you get that kind of splitting. Which in itself can be unhelpful because actually the reality is that often children flip from one to another, that sometimes they have intent to harm and sometimes it's much more reactive to what's their pain and the trauma that they've experienced. And children don't fall neatly into one camp because they will have experienced trauma in lots of different ways, or they will have a conduct disorder, let's say, or it's not a binary thing by any means. And then we started having, then in Canada, a group of people in Canada decided to ask parents what they felt it should be called. And said, we as professionals, we shouldn't be dictating what this is called. This is up to you to decide what it's called. You're experiencing it. Tell us what it feels like. Tell us what you want us to call it. And they came up with the term, and I can't remember what it's called, but they call it AFCCA, I think, and it's about
AFCCA. Is that
adolescent to family child? I'm going to look that up. I need to look that up. When Jane's talking, I'm going to look that up. And it feels like another mouthful because it's almost a sentence, and it kind of feels like we need something snappy because. Okay, we need the parents on board, we need families on board. They need to be able to tell us as professionals, as academics, what they want us to hear. That's really, really important. But it also needs to be something that professionals can understand, can grasp, can say quickly. We don't want to have a whole sentence every time, which is why we've started working in acronyms and initials all over the place. So many initials now, we don't know what we're doing. But also language changes and the way we feel about certain words evolves over time. And some words are acceptable to replace other words which have become loaded.
Yeah,
and
of course.
Perhaps are considered insulting or oppressive. So we change the words we use. But over time, those words also will become less acceptable. And so I tend to think that we need to have a phrase, a name, which is acceptable to everybody and everybody recognises, because then we can count it, we can hear what people are saying, we know what we're referring to very quickly. But I think it won't ever be set in stone. It will. We have to accept that it will change over time.
I think that's completely right, as that's what language does. It evolves, it changes, as we evolve and change. From my viewpoint, there's so many different terms for basically describing the same thing currently at the same time.
No, I think one of the things I was going to jump in and say there, Matt, is that for me is what makes it so difficult for parents to relate to, because I think it's so polarized from the professional point of view, isn't it? It's like, should it be abuse? Should it be aggression? What language do we use? What best sums up what we're talking about? And we haven't got it right. We're never going to please everybody. We know that. And it's a very emotive subject. So for me, I think that the danger, or not the danger, that's too strong a word, but for me, the concern is parents aren't connecting with it, so they're not getting support. So we need to figure out something that works, even if, like Helen alludes to, this umbrella term that maybe we're not all particularly happy with, but at least we can recognize it. But I think what we don't want to do, or for me, what's not helpful is to try to categorize us in an area that doesn't help parents.
So I can tell, sorry, I've just looked this up. So AFCCA, aggression towards family or caregivers in childhood and adolescence. And that's what it's been called by a particular group of people in Canada. So it's kind of, so they're happy with the word aggression, which for them, it describes a behaviour, but not in a loaded way about.
What do you guys feel about that? I mean, aggression, for me, I agree that I think that's important. That's what parents are seeing. You know, I don't have a problem with the word aggression.
It says what it says, doesn't it? I think for me, and again, it's families that we've worked with, it's harder to connect with abuse. It's not saying that it doesn't feel abusive for some family members. Not saying that at all.
And particularly those who've lived with domestic abuse, I think people will say it feels exactly the same. He saw his dad do this, now he's doing that. It feels the same thing.
And I'm certainly not suggesting that's not what we don't want to take that away from anybody at all. But for me, that changes the intent behind the behaviour. And it is aggressive behaviour. I think it was Dr. Nikki Rutter, who we had to one of our network events, Matt, just not that long ago, that was talking about, harmful and aggressive behaviours. It's very clear it is harmful because it's harmful to everybody who lives there, including the young person using the behaviour.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's often aggressive. Not always, but it can be aggressive. How it feels is unique to every individual, and whether that feels abusive or not is unique to everybody.
Yeah, I think you're right. I was going to do a bit of waffling, but I'm not going to. I thought I can edit that nicely.
And we started to say it's really important that everybody understands the same thing. We know what we're talking about. And I think that is one of the prime things, isn't it? That if a parent comes to us and they're using language that is different to the language we're using as practitioners, often there's a real mismatch and we don't understand, we don't hear each other properly. So as Jane's already said, if parents, families don't identify with the terminology, they think, oh, this isn't me, this isn't for me because I'm not experiencing abuse. They're perhaps feeling uncomfortable about coming forward for help. But equally, if they're talking about something in a way that we don't identify, we hear that something is not quite as bad as it is because people are maybe talking about tantrums or perhaps even feel reluctant to speak out in words how awful the situation is. Yeah. It's really important that we have agreed terminology. So that's kind of the first aspect of why it's so important to have an agreed name. But also there is the aspect that if we want to be able to collect data, if we want to be able to compare around the country, if we want to be able to conduct research that is meaningful, we're going to have to use terminology which allows us to do that. And if we've got 16, 30 different terminologies that we're using, it's very difficult then for people to combine all that data. They don't all mean exactly the same thing. And so we can't do a proper compare and contrast because there'll be differences in what people are measuring. And so that it's the kind of, and we feel a bit uncomfortable saying, if we've got to name it so we can count it, because actually families aren't maybe interested in us counting it. They want us to solve it. But we have to have that kind of cold-heartedness about us as well, I'm afraid, that is, we need to be able to nail this so that we can actually prove our case that this is the situation. We need the resources to deal with this because here we can show you it's increased year on year. These are the figures. This is the number of families. We can only really properly do that if we have an actual agreed name, in my opinion.
I agree with that, Helen, but I think I have a hesitancy about it in some ways. Just, I think for me, purely because, emails from a professional a month ago asking, do we support children as young as 3? We're working with families where children are 6 or 7. I think labeling is a very something we love to do. We love to label things and label behavior and label what we're seeing. And whilst I see the importance of it from a research point of view and data collection point of view, which will help us, I suppose, equates to more support, more understanding around the area, labeling a child who's very young as a perpetrator of abuse just doesn't sit very comfortably.
Absolutely.
And I you're not saying that, and I'm not hearing you saying that, but I'm very clear, for our organisation, the communities that we work with and the families that we've worked with, about what we do land on has got to be right, hasn't it? It's so hard.
But I guess that's definitely the why the terminology is moving away from abuse, because the behaviour might be particularly difficult to manage from a younger age as well. And you're certainly not going to say like a 2-year-old is abusive. That it doesn't really, that doesn't make sense. But you can certainly say that the behaviour is perhaps different from what you might expect. So you might think, okay, there is an issue here. There's something's different here than what you might expect.
And I think one of the things I was just thinking about and was going to say is, how do we interpret the behaviour of a 6-year-old compared to the behaviour of a 16-year-old?
Yeah.
How do we interpret that behaviour, and how do we view that behaviour as a family member or a society? So does it make it easier for us to label a 16-year-old as being abusive, and it doesn't maybe help us feel more comfortable with a 6-year-old being that? I personally don't like the idea of saying a 16-year-old is abusive, because for me it's all behind what's behind the behaviour. Definitely. Why is it happening, and does that help us then understand labels any easier? Because if we say, well, it's okay for the 16-year-old to pop along to the domestic abuse organisation to get support, which is very clearly labelled victim and perpetrator, would we be as happy to do that for a 6-year-old? So, it does create barriers. But is the behaviour derived from the same place and for the same reasons?
I think we could probably go on for even, quite a long time, even longer around this, and I guess that is why there are so many names for it. There is so much discussion around how we're going to define this issue.
And I think we'll unpick those sort of things as we go along as well. I don't think we can possibly, answer it. Or it's such
Helen
a big
said that
thing
at the start,
to
didn't
answer.
she? She said it's probably never. Yeah. It's probably we're never going to get there. So.
And I think
we can
our
try.
views and what, and I think we'll talk about that broadly as well as we continue.
Yeah.
Which is why I think having these sessions for us to talk about this, I'm hoping, will be helpful for anybody listening to it, because it is about things changing. It is about discussing it in a way that I'm certainly not sitting here as an expert saying this is what has to happen. I'm just reflecting what I'm seeing with those that I'm working with and who I'm talking to, and feel like it's just a reflection back, as opposed to saying I'm sitting here as an expert saying this is what needs to happen.
I've got it all worked out. Let me tell you guys. Yeah,
exactly. One of the things of setting up an organisation like Capa, every family is unique and every piece of work is bespoke, because for what may be an issue for one family may not be an issue for another. What may be an issue for one person in the family may not be an issue for another person in the family. You have to look at each individual family and think, what's going on for them?
Yeah.
What's the bit that was the disconnect?
Yeah.
That contributed to a young person figuring out that actually in order for them to be heard, we all need to be heard, and for a child and a young person to be validated, they needed to actually use these aggressive and harmful behaviours in order to get something communicated to somebody and as an outlet for how they were feeling.
Yeah.
And there are similarities within families and similarities in the behaviour. Of course there are, but it's about working with what's in front of you. It's about looking and supporting a family and looking at what's going on for them. What's the networks? What's the history? What's happened? What's led to? And that way is how we can then help support families to change it, I think.
Yeah. I think it's so important to be led as well by the families that you work with, as you were saying there. Say, what's important to you? What is the need for you? How do you see it? Because I think it's really unhelpful as professionals to come in and go, right, this is I know the problem here. This is it, and I'm going to tell you all about it, and that's it. Because that is a surefire way to turn families away, in my experience, and for them to go, oh, okay, well, look, I didn't feel. Even in that situation, the parents don't feel seen or heard.
Don't feel heard, yeah.
Yeah, and then you're just perpetuating the problem, really. What would you like people to think about in terms of the way they talk about this behaviour and the way they refer to it? Is there anything that you'd like to sort of share or your thoughts on it?
I think it is becoming much easier for people to talk about it. There's a lot of representation in the media, in mainstream media, articles on the even this week there was something, a terrible situation that was reported on BBC about a family with a 10-year-old girl. And so it is out there, and so that should help us to have the conversations. It should help people to understand that this is a thing in a much more coherent way. Although even as I say that, I guess the way things are reported can impact the way other people understand or think about what's going on. But it has to be good that we're talking about it more. It has to be good that it's out there, that people know that this is a thing that will make it easier for people to come forward. But there are a lot of reasons still why it's difficult to come forward, aren't there? And one of those is to do with what we call it, how we understand what's going on. Yeah. And how we as professionals respond so that we're not dismissing people. We're spending the time to listen to families so they feel heard.
So you would hope that professionals would always take the time to listen and make the families feel heard. What else could professionals do to engage more positively, with families, and best help them?
It feels so important that before you were saying, Matt, about okay, this is what the problem is, this is what you need to do. It feels so important that we ask families what they've tried already.
Yeah.
Tell me what's worked, what hasn't worked, what have you done already? How many parenting courses have you been sent on already? Before we start diving in and saying, well, this is what you need to do, we need to do such a thorough hearing of what's going on before we start to speak. I think that would be my main takeaway.
Nice.
And I spoke to a parent last Friday, so a couple of days ago, and she said, I had a really good experience with a professional. They didn't judge me. They didn't blame me. And they listened to me. And they wanted to work with me. And I think they're really key things. It's listening to what that person's experience is and what that family's experience is. It's not judging the situation or judging what's happened, because often, as we know, not helpful. It's not about blaming anybody for what's happening. It's not about blaming the young person or the child or the parent. And it's about working with a family, just exactly what Helen said, the question, and we always ask a parent when we're working with them, tell us what works for you. Tell us what's worked so far. Tell us how you've managed so far, because there's lots of positives that you've already done. So it's really listening and working collaboratively with the family.
That is, I think, for me as well, one of the absolute key points, working collaboratively, because you need to, that is showing respect, isn't it?
But it's not setting you up to say, you got to go in and you got to do this, this and this, because the moment this and this doesn't work, a parent's going to be like, well, what do I do now? Yeah. It's really disheartening for a parent to be told to do, you've got to do this and you've got to do this and you've got to do that. And then a young person's behavior escalates.
Yeah.
Often parenting courses are all about punitive measures, about your child doesn't come off a computer at 10 o'clock, then you've got to take the computer away. That's going to escalate violence in a lot of families. So it's not about the punitive measures that are put in place. It's working with, I completely went off track with what I was talking about there. So you have to edit that, Matt.
Yeah, you're okay.
But I felt really passionate, clearly.
Yeah.
It's not about telling a parent they've got to have a punitive measure in place, because then a parent can become, it can often fracture the relationship even more.
Well, do you know what? I'm not gonna edit that out, because I think it's important to leave it in, Jane, because if we're thinking about overarching ways of looking at this, and how we would hope that professionals and parents, I guess, might be able to look at this, I'd really agree with that it's not about just ratcheting up those punitive measures. It's about looking at your relationship and looking at starting to rebuild it. Because if things have come to this point, there is damage done to your relationship. So it's about getting your relationship back to a stronger place.
And that's easier said than done, isn't it, Matt? I mean, that's what we spend our working week doing, is talking to parents about that, because it's not that easy.
No, it's not that easy. But I think one of the things that I would add is it's kind of using what Helen said, is finding those things that have worked and building on, finding the reasons for hope and bringing that back into focus.
Yeah.
There is almost always something that has worked. There is almost always something that you can, find hope in. Connect with and find hope in. Yeah, because, and I think that is, for me, that's the most, one of the most important aspects of working with families, is helping them reconnect with that hope that things, can get better, and their relationship with their child can get back to the place where they want it to be, and where often it used to be. And I think that's a real key thing.
A parent said to us not that long ago, Matt, and talking to us, it gave me hope again where I thought there was none.